If you look at me like that again, the man said in a voice so calm it barely rose above the soft music drifting through the restaurant, you'll regret making me wonder why. Every conversation within a few feet seemed to disappear. Crystal glasses caught the glow of amber chandeliers, polished mahogany reflected flickering candlelight, and somewhere beyond the panoramic windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath a cool October evening. Ava Carter froze with a porcelain dinner plate balanced carefully in her hands. Her warm brown eyes widened, not from fear alone, but from confusion. She hadn't meant to stare. She hadn't even realized she had. The sharply dressed customer sitting alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows looked nothing like the men who usually filled Bellissimo's private dining room. He never laughed too loudly. Never bragged. Never demanded attention. He simply arrived every Friday evening at exactly 7 o'clock, ordered the same filet mignon cooked medium rare, sparkling water with fresh lemon, and black coffee before leaving an unusually generous tip folded neatly beneath the check. To Ava, he was simply another kind customer, perhaps lonely, perhaps thoughtful, perhaps carrying burdens too heavy to explain. She had no idea that newspapers avoided printing his name, politicians lowered their voices whenever he entered a room, and powerful businessmen quietly adjusted their schedules whenever Vincent Romano requested a meeting. She certainly didn't know that many people considered him one of the most influential mafia dons on the East Coast. All she saw was a man whose gray eyes reminded her of someone she had spent years missing. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, lowering her gaze immediately. "I didn't mean to be rude." Vincent Romano watched her for another silent moment. He was 37, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Italian suit that seemed tailored to perfection, every movement controlled with almost unnatural precision. His expression revealed little, but behind those unreadable eyes something had shifted. For 3 consecutive Fridays he had caught the same waitress looking at him with the exact same lingering expression. Not flirtation. Not curiosity. Something deeper. Something strangely familiar. In his world, prolonged eye contact usually meant hidden motives, calculated intentions, or dangerous questions. He had survived too long by ignoring neither. Yet there was something about Ava Carter that refused to fit any pattern he understood. She never lingered around wealthy guests hoping for larger tips. She never accepted invitations from customers. She smiled politely, worked quickly, and disappeared into the rhythm of the restaurant before anyone could remember she had been there. "Just don't do it again," Vincent replied quietly before lifting his coffee cup. His tone carried no anger, only quiet certainty, as though he expected the conversation to end exactly there. Ava nodded and walked away, but her heartbeat refused to slow. She couldn't understand why standing near him always felt so strangely emotional. She wasn't fascinated by his expensive watch, his tailored suits, or the quiet authority surrounding him. She wasn't even looking at the man himself. Every accidental glance carried her somewhere else entirely, back to childhood afternoons on a front porch in Cleveland, where her father would smile with the same patient eyes before leaving for another long shift he never complained about. She had buried that smile years ago. Somehow, impossibly, she had found it again sitting alone beside a candlelit window, wearing a charcoal suit instead of faded work clothes. Neither of them realized that one misunderstood glance had already begun changing both of their lives. Ava Carter finished her shift a little after 11 that night, changed out of her black uniform, and stepped into the crisp Manhattan air with a canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. The bright lights surrounding Bellissimo slowly faded behind her as she walked 3 blocks to the subway station, passing luxury boutiques that displayed handbags worth more than she earned in several months. She rarely stopped to look. Life had taught her long ago that admiring things she could never afford only made the walk home feel longer. 45 minutes later she unlocked the door to a modest apartment in Queensware. The scent of chicken noodle soup still lingered in the kitchen. Her 16-year-old brother, Caleb, was asleep on the couch with a geometry textbook resting across his chest and the television quietly playing an old baseball game. Ava smiled as she carefully removed the book without waking him. Since their mother passed away 4 years earlier and their father had died long before that, the apartment had become more than a home. It had become the entire world she was trying to protect. Every double shift, every aching pair of feet, every late train ride had a purpose. Caleb dreamed of attending college, and Ava refused to let money become the reason that dream disappeared. The following morning began before sunrise. While most of the city still slept, Ava prepared breakfast, packed Caleb's lunch, reminded him about his science presentation, and left a handwritten note wishing him luck before catching another train to her morning cleaning job inside a downtown office building. By noon she had already vacuumed conference rooms, polished glass walls, and emptied dozens of wastebaskets before changing into fresh clothes inside the employee restroom and heading back to Bellissimo for the evening shift. Her coworkers often wondered why she never complained. The restaurant manager, Anthony Russo, had once offered her fewer hours after noticing the dark circles beneath her eyes, but Ava politely declined. She always smiled, thanked him, and continued working as though exhaustion were simply another part of the uniform. What no one realized was that every dollar had already been assigned before she earned it. Rent, utilities, grocery bills, Caleb's school supplies. A small savings account she quietly added to every payday. There was never enough left over for herself, yet somehow she never seemed bitter. Guests noticed her kindness more than her fatigue. Children smiled when she remembered their favorite desserts. Elderly couples requested her section because she never rushed them. Business executives appreciated how she anticipated what they needed before they asked. Among all those familiar faces, one customer remained impossible to understand. Vincent Romano appeared every Friday with almost mechanical consistency. He always thanked her when she refilled his coffee. He never looked at his phone during dinner. Sometimes he gazed through the enormous windows overlooking the city as though searching for something that no skyline could offer. Ava found herself wondering what kind of life allowed someone to wear such expensive suits while carrying eyes that looked unexpectedly lonely. She still felt embarrassed about the awkward exchange from the previous evening and silently promised herself she would never accidentally stare again. Unknown to her, Vincent had already asked Anthony Russo a simple question before leaving the restaurant. He had not asked about the menu, the wine selection, or the reservation schedule. He had only looked toward the kitchen and quietly said, "The young waitress who served me. How long has she worked here?" Anthony answered honestly. "Almost 2 years, sir. One of the hardest workers I have ever hired." Vincent gave a thoughtful nod, left another generous tip, and walked into the waiting black sedan without saying another word. For reasons he could not explain, the memory of Ava Carter's eyes followed him all the way home. The following Friday arrived with steady autumn rain that painted silver streaks across the restaurant windows and covered the sidewalks with shimmering reflections. Inside Bellissimo, everything remained elegant and unhurried. Crystal chandeliers beiged the dining room in warm light while a pianist quietly played familiar jazz standards that blended with the soft conversations of wealthy guests. Ava adjusted the sleeves of her freshly pressed uniform before beginning another evening of carrying polished trays through the crowded dining room. She reminded herself to remain focused, especially if the familiar customer returned. At exactly 7 o'clock, the front doors opened, and Vincent Romano stepped inside as though time itself had been waiting for him. The maitre d' greeted him by name with respectful formality and escorted him toward the same corner table overlooking the city skyline. Nothing about his routine changed. The charcoal suit was replaced by deep navy, but everything else remained identical. The same composed expression. The same measured pace. The same quiet thank you as he accepted the menu he never really needed. Ava noticed him only because every server instinctively glanced toward new arrivals. She immediately looked away and concentrated on greeting another family seated nearby. Anthony Russo observed the exchange from behind the host stand and quietly smiled to himself. It fascinated him that one of his most reserved employees seemed to be the only person in the restaurant who treated Vincent Romano exactly like everyone else. Most guests who recognized Vincent either stared too long or pretended not to notice him at all. Ava did neither. She simply did her job. Or at least she tried to. Throughout the evening, circumstances seemed determined to place them together. A different server accidentally spilled sparkling water near Vincent's table, and Anthony asked Ava to replace the linens because she handled unexpected situations with remarkable calm. Later, the kitchen became overwhelmed with a large private event, and Anthony personally requested that Ava deliver Vincent's dinner because she knew exactly how he preferred every plate arranged. Neither of them had planned these encounters, yet they happened one after another until even Vincent began noticing the pattern. Each time Ava approached, she remained professional, careful never to hold his gaze longer than necessary. Yet every few minutes he caught her studying his face for a brief second before looking away again with an expression he still could not interpret. It was not admiration. It was not fear. It resembled someone searching for an answer hidden inside an old photograph. Vincent found himself doing something he almost never allowed. He became curious. Curiosity had always been dangerous in his world because it encouraged attachment, and attachment often clouded judgment. Still, he quietly watched the young waitress move through the restaurant. She treated every guest with identical kindness whether they ordered a simple bowl of soup or the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu. She laughed gently with elderly couples, patiently explained unfamiliar dishes to tourists, and knelt beside a little girl to replace a dropped spoon without making the child feel embarrassed. Nothing about her appeared rehearsed. Compassion seemed as natural to her as breathing. Near the end of the evening, an elderly gentleman dining alone struggled to reach the cane leaning against his chair. Before anyone else noticed, Ava crossed the room, handed it to him with a warm smile, and wished him a safe trip home. Vincent lowered his coffee cup and watched the old man leave with grateful eyes. For the first time in many years, he found himself wondering whether genuine kindness still existed without expectation of reward. Across the dining room, Ava finally allowed herself one quick glance toward the window table. Vincent happened to look up at that exact moment. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat before she quietly smiled with unexpected sadness and returned to her work. Vincent did not look away immediately. Instead, he found himself asking a question that refused to leave his mind. Who was she remembering every time she looked at him like that? By the middle of November, Bellissimo had settled into its familiar rhythm, yet something invisible had begun changing beneath the polished surface. Ava noticed it first in the quiet whispers that stopped whenever she entered the staff hallway. Two newer servers exchanged knowing smiles whenever Vincent Romano appeared, and one evening she caught them glancing from his table back toward her with raised eyebrows. She tried to ignore it. Restaurants were built on conversation, and conversations often turned ordinary moments into stories far larger than the truth. Unfortunately, rumors had a way of growing without permission. During the dinner rush, one of the bartenders leaned against the espresso machine and said with a playful grin, "You know, if a man tips like that every Friday, maybe he is coming back for more than the coffee." Several employees laughed softly. Ava forced a polite smile but felt uncomfortable. "He is just a regular customer," she answered. "Please do not make something out of nothing." The laughter faded, yet the comments continued over the following weeks. Some joked that the mysterious businessman had a favorite waitress. Others insisted they had seen him watching Ava whenever she crossed the dining room. None of them understood that Ava spent most of every shift trying not to look toward his table at all. She feared another awkward misunderstanding, and more importantly, she did not want anyone believing she treated one guest differently from another. Anthony Russo eventually noticed the growing speculation and called everyone together before opening one evening. He reminded the staff that every customer deserved privacy and respect. Bellissimo had earned its reputation because employees remained professional regardless of who walked through the front door. The message was clear, and the gossip became quieter, but it never disappeared completely. Vincent sensed the change as well. People had always watched him. Wealth attracted attention, and influence often invited curiosity. That part no longer surprised him. What surprised him was seeing Ava become noticeably more careful each week. She no longer delivered his meals unless another server was unavailable. She kept conversations brief, maintained perfect professionalism, and rarely allowed herself to look in his direction. For reasons he could not explain, that bothered him more than it should have. One rainy evening, as she placed his coffee beside the dessert plate, Vincent noticed her hands trembling almost imperceptibly. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly. Ava blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir. Everything is fine." Her answer came too quickly to sound convincing. Before he could say anything else, Anthony called her name from across the dining room, and she excused herself with an apologetic smile. Vincent watched her disappear into the kitchen, sensing that the distance between them had grown despite speaking more words than ever before. What neither of them realized was that someone else had been paying close attention. An elderly woman who visited the restaurant every Wednesday had quietly observed Ava for months. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks often requested the same small table near the windows because it reminded her of evenings she once shared with her late husband. She noticed details most people overlooked. She saw Ava slip extra bread into a takeout bag for a struggling single father after receiving the manager's approval. She saw her comfort a frightened little boy who had become separated from his parents for only a few anxious minutes. She also noticed the expression on Ava's face whenever Vincent Romano entered the restaurant. It was never excitement. Never admiration. It carried the unmistakable tenderness of someone remembering a person they wished they could speak to one more time. Eleanor folded her napkin carefully, looked toward Vincent's corner table, and whispered almost to herself, "Young man, you are asking the wrong question. She is not wondering who you are. She is wondering who you remind her of." Across the softly glowing dining room, Vincent lifted his coffee cup, unaware that the answer he had been searching for had been sitting only a few tables away all along. The first snow of the season arrived quietly on a Thursday afternoon, covering the sidewalks outside Bellissimo with a thin blanket of white that softened even the constant rush of Manhattan. Inside the restaurant, warmth wrapped around every table as guests escaped the cold with steaming bowls of soup and glowing candlelight. Ava balanced a tray of desserts while weaving carefully between tables when the corner of her canvas apron brushed against a chair. She barely noticed that the small leather wallet tucked into her pocket slipped free and landed silently on the polished hardwood floor. A few moments later, Vincent Romano stood to leave after finishing his coffee. As he adjusted his coat, something near the leg of his chair caught his attention. It was an old, weathered photograph that had fallen halfway out of the wallet lying beside the table. Without thinking, he bent down, picked up both items, and instinctively glanced at the faded picture before calling for Ava. The image stopped him completely. A smiling African-American man stood beside a little girl no older than 8 years old. They were sitting on the front porch of a modest house, both laughing at something outside the frame. The man's gentle gray eyes, calm expression, and quiet smile felt strangely familiar. Vincent stared at the photograph for several long seconds before realizing why. The resemblance was remarkable. The shape of the eyes, the patient expression, even the slight tilt of the smile mirrored his own face in ways that logic could not explain. Ava hurried toward him, her face immediately filling with panic as she recognized the wallet in his hand. "I am so sorry," she said breathlessly. "I did not even realize I dropped it." Vincent held the photograph carefully instead of returning it immediately. "Is this your father?" he asked. Ava looked at the picture, and her entire expression softened. The tension disappeared from her shoulders, replaced by quiet sadness that seemed years old. "Yes," she answered gently. "That was taken when I was 8 years old. It is my favorite picture of him." Vincent looked at the photograph once more before meeting her eyes. "He looks familiar." Ava smiled with the kind of smile that only appeared when someone spoke about a person they deeply loved. Everyone used to tell him he had kind eyes. They always said people trusted him within minutes of meeting him. She paused for a moment, carefully taking the photograph back before sliding it into the wallet. He passed away when I was 12. Sometimes I catch myself looking at strangers because they remind me of him, even if only for a second. She lowered her eyes, suddenly realizing what she had admitted. I owe you an apology. Every time I looked at you. Her voice grew quieter. I was never really looking at you. I kept seeing pieces of my father. I know that probably sounds strange. For several seconds Vincent said nothing. The restaurant continued around them with the soft clinking of silverware and distant piano music, yet the noise seemed impossibly far away. Every misunderstanding from the past several weeks dissolved in a single sentence. She had never been studying him with hidden intentions. She had been searching for a memory she could not bear to lose. Vincent slowly handed her wallet back. It does not sound strange, he replied with unexpected warmth. Sometimes memories find us in unexpected places. Ava nodded gratefully, unaware that something had quietly shifted inside the man standing before her. As she walked back toward the kitchen, Vincent remained beside the window, watching gentle snowflakes drift through the city lights. For the first time in many years, the walls he had spent a lifetime building around his heart felt just a little less impossible to climb. The conversation beside the snow-covered window remained in Vincent Romano's thoughts long after he left Bellissimo that evening. During the drive across Manhattan, he looked through the city lights without hearing most of what his driver was saying. He had spent years believing that every unusual glance carried a hidden purpose, every unexpected kindness concealed an advantage waiting to be claimed. Yet Ava Carter had asked for nothing. She had not recognized his influence. She had not tried to impress him. She had simply seen a reflection of the father she still missed. That realization lingered in his mind with unusual persistence. The following week, Vincent quietly asked his longtime assistant, Daniel Brooks, to learn more about the young waitress, but he gave one condition before Daniel could respond. No interference, Vincent said calmly. I want facts, not favors. Do not change her life. Just help me understand it. Daniel nodded, accustomed to unusual requests but surprised by the gentleness in his employer's voice. 2 days later, he returned with a thin folder that contained only publicly available information. Ava Carter had worked continuously since graduating from high school. She held 2 jobs for several years before Bellissimo promoted her to full-time. She had no criminal record, no lawsuits, no unpaid debts beyond ordinary student expenses she paid on schedule every month. She volunteered twice each month at a neighborhood food pantry and spent most weekends helping elderly residents in her apartment building carry groceries or shovel snow after winter storms. Daniel closed the folder and quietly added, everyone we spoke with described her the same way. Honest. Dependable. Kind. Vincent remained silent for several moments before asking another question. Her brother? Daniel glanced at the notes. Caleb Carter. 16 years old. Excellent grades. Teachers expect he will qualify for several college scholarships if he keeps performing at this level. Vincent slowly nodded. There was no hidden story waiting to be uncovered. No elaborate plan. No manipulation. Only a young woman carrying responsibilities that would have overwhelmed many people twice her age. That Friday evening, Bellissimo looked as elegant as ever, decorated with evergreen garlands and golden lights for the approaching Christmas season. Ava welcomed guests with the same warm smile she offered every week, unaware that Vincent already knew more about her daily life than she could have imagined. He noticed details he had overlooked before. She discreetly offered a warm blanket to an elderly guest who had forgotten her coat. She patiently helped a nervous young couple choose an affordable dinner without making them feel embarrassed about their budget. When a little boy accidentally dropped his cup of hot chocolate, Ava knelt beside him, assuring him that accidents happen to everyone before bringing him another drink at no additional charge after receiving Anthony Russo's approval. None of those gestures earned applause. Most guests never even noticed them. Vincent did. As he prepared to leave, Anthony approached his table with the evening check. "Everything satisfactory as always, sir?" Anthony asked politely. Vincent gave a small smile. "More than satisfactory." He looked briefly toward the dining room where Ava was helping an elderly couple gather their scarves before facing Anthony once more. "You hired someone remarkable." Anthony followed his gaze and smiled knowingly. "She makes this place better every single day." Vincent quietly folded the receipt, leaving his customary generous tip beneath the check, but for the first time it no longer felt like gratitude for excellent service alone. It felt like respect for a kind of quiet strength that money could never purchase. As he stepped outside into the cold December air, gentle snowflakes settled across the shoulders of his dark overcoat. Somewhere behind him, through the glowing restaurant windows, Ava laughed softly at something Caleb had texted her during his study break. Vincent did not hear the words, but the sound itself made him realize that protecting someone's peace sometimes began with simply refusing to disturb it. Christmas arrived with a quiet elegance that transformed Bellissimo into something almost magical. Evergreen garlands framed the tall windows, golden ribbons wrapped around polished columns, and the scent of cinnamon and fresh pine drifted gently through the dining room. Families gathered for holiday dinners while soft piano melodies floated beneath the warm conversations filling every corner of the restaurant. Ava Carter loved this season despite how exhausting it always became. She worked extra shifts without complaint because holiday tips helped cover heating bills, groceries, and the growing college savings account she secretly maintained for Caleb. Every dollar represented another small promise she intended to keep. One snowy afternoon, just before the dinner rush began, Anthony Russo gathered the staff near the front entrance with an unexpected announcement. A charitable foundation had chosen Bellissimo to sponsor several local families for the holidays by covering groceries, winter clothing, and educational expenses. The donors wished to remain anonymous. Everyone applauded, grateful that struggling families would receive help during the coldest weeks of the year. Ava smiled along with everyone else, never imagining that her own name appeared quietly on the confidential list. 2 evenings later, she returned home after another long shift and immediately noticed several neatly wrapped boxes waiting outside her apartment door. At first she looked up and down the hallway, convinced they had been delivered to the wrong address. Attached to the largest package was a simple handwritten card. "For your family. Merry Christmas." Nothing more. No signature. Inside she found a warm winter coat in Caleb's exact size, several grocery gift cards, new textbooks he had mentioned needing next semester, and a high-quality scientific calculator identical to the one displayed in the school bookstore that they had quietly agreed was too expensive. Ava lowered herself onto the edge of the couch, staring silently at the unopened boxes. Caleb emerged from his bedroom equally surprised, and together they searched every package for a clue. There was none. "Maybe somebody from church," Caleb suggested hopefully. Ava smiled faintly but shook her head. "Whoever it was, they knew exactly what we needed." Across the city, Vincent Romano stood beside the wide windows of his office overlooking Manhattan as gentle snow continued falling over the skyline. Daniel Brooks entered carrying several folders requiring signatures, but Vincent barely glanced at them. "Were the deliveries completed?" he asked quietly. Daniel nodded. Every family received exactly what they needed. No names were attached, just as you requested. Vincent looked back toward the snow-covered rooftops. "Good." Daniel hesitated before asking, "Should Miss Carter ever know?" Vincent answered without turning around. "No. Kindness loses something when it expects recognition." Meanwhile, life at Bellissimo continued much as before. Ava remained unaware that the anonymous foundation Anthony had mentioned existed only because Vincent had quietly created it years earlier to help families without drawing attention to himself. She simply believed that somewhere in the city lived generous strangers who still believed in people they had never met. On the final Friday before Christmas, Vincent arrived for dinner as usual. Ava greeted him with the same warm professionalism she offered every guest, but something about her smile looked lighter than it had in months. She seemed genuinely at peace. As she placed his coffee on the table, she spoke almost absent-mindedly. "I hope whoever you spend the holidays with reminds you how important you are." Vincent looked at her for a long moment before replying softly, "Sometimes people remind us of that without ever realizing they have done it." Ava smiled politely, assuming he was simply being courteous, and returned to the dining room. Vincent watched her disappear among the softly glowing lights, carrying trays from one table to another with quiet grace. For the first time in many years, Christmas no longer felt like another date on the calendar. It felt like the beginning of a debt of gratitude he had only just begun to understand. The first week of January arrived with clear skies and sharp winter air that made every breath visible outside Bellissimo. Holiday decorations had been carefully packed away, leaving the restaurant once again wrapped in understated elegance. Life seemed to settle back into familiar routines, yet for Vincent Romano, something had changed permanently. He no longer came every Friday simply because he appreciated the quiet table by the window. He came because somewhere between the polished floors, warm candlelight, and gentle piano music, he had rediscovered a version of himself that had almost disappeared beneath years of responsibility. One evening, after finishing dinner, Vincent remained seated longer than usual. Ava noticed the untouched cup of coffee growing cold beside him and approached with her usual gentle smile. "Would you like me to bring a fresh cup?" she asked. Vincent looked at her before slowly shaking his head. "No. I was just thinking." Ava smiled politely. "Sometimes that takes longer than dinner." The unexpected remark made Vincent laugh softly, a quiet sound that surprised even him. Anthony Russo happened to witness the exchange from across the dining room and stopped walking for a brief moment. In all the years Vincent had been visiting Bellissimo, he had never once seen the reserved businessman laugh. After Ava returned to another table, Vincent glanced toward the framed photographs decorating one wall of the restaurant. They displayed local community events Bellissimo had supported over the years. One photograph immediately caught his attention. A younger Anthony stood beside volunteers serving meals at a neighborhood shelter almost 5 years earlier. Among the smiling faces stood a familiar African-American man with kind gray eyes. Vincent slowly stood and walked closer. The resemblance was unmistakable. It was the same man from Ava's faded childhood photograph. Anthony noticed Vincent studying the picture and joined him. "That is Marcus Carter," Anthony said warmly. "One of the finest men I have ever known." Vincent remained silent. Anthony continued, his voice carrying quiet admiration. "Marcus volunteered here every month even after working full shifts as a city bus driver. He always said that if someone had enough strength to help another person, then they already had enough." Anthony smiled faintly at the memory. He never accepted praise. He would simply say kindness worked best when nobody kept score. Vincent felt something tighten gently inside his chest. "You knew him well?" Anthony nodded. Everyone did. When he passed away unexpectedly, the neighborhood collected money to help his family, but his daughter politely returned part of it because she believed other families needed it more. That little girl was Ava. Vincent looked once more at Marcus Carter's smiling face preserved inside the frame. Suddenly the anonymous gifts, the quiet respect, and every thoughtful choice he had made over the past weeks felt strangely incomplete. He had believed he was helping a deserving young woman. Now he realized he had unknowingly been walking the same path her father had traveled years before. Later that evening, as Ava prepared to leave for home, Anthony called her into his office. "Someone left this behind," he said, handing her a neatly framed copy of the old community photograph that had recently been restored by a local historical society. Ava stared at the image in disbelief as tears quietly filled her eyes. Her father stood there smiling exactly as she remembered him. "I have never seen this picture before," she whispered. Anthony smiled gently. Your father made this city better than most people ever knew. Ava carefully held the frame against her coat before stepping outside into the cold evening. Through the restaurant window, Vincent watched her pause beneath the glowing streetlights, looking at the photograph with quiet gratitude. He realized then that honoring someone's memory was never about replacing what had been lost. It was about making sure the goodness they left behind continued touching lives long after they were gone. Nearly 1 year passed before Vincent Romano and Ava Carter truly understood how deeply one ordinary evening had changed both of their lives. Winter slowly surrendered to spring, spring welcomed the warmth of summer, and the city outside Bellissimo continued moving with its familiar urgency while quiet transformations unfolded inside the lives of two people who had once been complete strangers. Caleb Carter received acceptance letters from several universities, along with enough scholarships to begin pursuing his dream of studying engineering. The small savings account Ava had protected through years of sacrifice would now cover the expenses scholarships could not. On the evening Caleb shared the news, Ava stood alone on the apartment balcony looking toward the Manhattan skyline. She quietly thanked her parents for every lesson they had left behind, believing with all her heart that they would have been proud. The following Friday, Bellissimo welcomed another busy dinner service. Anthony Russo greeted returning guests, the pianist played softly near the entrance, and candlelight reflected across polished crystal exactly as it had the night Vincent first misunderstood a lingering glance. Some traditions never changed. At precisely 7 o'clock, Vincent entered through the front doors wearing a tailored navy suit and the same calm expression that had once seemed impossible to read. Yet something about him had become unmistakably different. The invisible weight he used to carry had softened. The distance between him and the rest of the world no longer seemed quite so absolute. Ava approached his table carrying a fresh pot of coffee. This time, when their eyes met, neither of them looked away. There was no awkwardness left between them, only quiet understanding built through months of unspoken respect. As she filled his cup, Vincent noticed the familiar framed photograph resting inside a small silver locket around her neck. Marcus Carter smiled from the tiny picture exactly as he had in the restored photograph Anthony had given her months before. Vincent smiled gently. Your father would be very proud of you. Ava paused before answering, her voice carrying quiet gratitude. I think he would tell me that kindness always finds its way back home. Vincent lowered his eyes for a brief moment before speaking again. He already proved that. Ava looked at him with the same warm expression that had once confused him so completely. This time he understood every part of it. She had never searched for wealth, influence, or admiration. She had simply carried the memory of a good man wherever she went, and because of that memory she treated every stranger with the same compassion her father had shown the world. Before leaving, Vincent placed the dinner check beneath his empty coffee cup as usual. This time, however, he left something else beside it. It was a handwritten note folded neatly in half. After he walked out into the cool evening air, Ava opened it quietly. There was only one sentence written in careful script. Thank you for reminding me that the strongest people are not the ones who command respect, but the ones who quietly give it away every single day. She read the words twice before carefully placing the note inside the same wallet that still protected her childhood photograph. Through the tall restaurant windows, Vincent paused on the sidewalk and glanced back one final time. Ava happened to look up at that exact moment. Their eyes met across the warm golden light, but now there was no misunderstanding waiting between them. Only gratitude. Only peace. Vincent smiled first. Ava smiled back without hesitation. Neither of them waved. They did not need to. Some stories were never meant to end with grand declarations. Some were meant to end with two people finally seeing one another exactly as they truly were. And on that quiet New York evening, beneath the glow of city lights and the gentle reflection of crystal windows, the world became just a little kinder because one daughter never stopped carrying her father's kindness, and one powerful man finally remembered that dignity is not measured by power, wealth, or reputation, but by the way a person chooses to see the humanity in someone else.